The Virtue Ethics of Aristotle. Aristotle lived from 384 to 322 BC, and he is part of the great Greek trilogy of Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. Athens at this time was the great center of learning for the ancient world, and Aristotle was born in Macedonia, which was part of that greater Greek culture. He hears about what's going on in Athens, and he wants to go there to study. So he travels to Athens, and he begins to attend Plato's academy. He's going to study under Plato at the academy for about 20 years, right up until the death of Plato in 347. Now when that happens and Plato dies, people naturally assume, well, Aristotle's going to take over the school. This guy is so brilliant, he was the most intelligent of all of Plato's students. But yet, Plato saw to it that that didn't happen. Aristotle was passed over in favor of giving the role of headmaster to Plato's cousin. Aristotle will leave and establish his own school, the Lyceum, and he will begin to teach and instruct from there. Now here on the screen we see an image of the classical classical Aristotle on the side there in marble. And on the other side we see a bit actually of a famous painting from Raphael. And in here you see a dispute between Plato and Aristotle. Plato is pointing upwards because for him everything is about that other realm, that other world, whereas Aristotle is pointing down to the ground, which shows us that he's a very practical, down-to-earth kind of thinker. And I think this is one of the reasons why Aristotle is such a prominent figure, is because he's one of the first to really recognize that we are part of the material world, and that we need to interact with each other and worry about what's going on here, and not just try to escape from here to get to someplace else. Aristotle was really a Renaissance man long before that word was ever coined. He was an absolute genius who was interested in practically everything. He becomes a pioneer in a number of different fields. He's a pioneer in the philosophy of mathematics, the philosophy of science, a very early pioneer in psychology. He basically creates the discipline of formal logic, and he's really kind of an early pioneer in Western ethics as well. Aristotle's primary work on ethics is called the Nicomachean Ethics. The Nicomachean Ethics was named after his grandson, Nicomachus. It was basically dedicated to him. I have also on the screen here Aristotle's work, The Politics, because what is rather interesting is the fact that Aristotle saw these two as really being companion pieces. The ethics dealt with our personal self and our personal relationships. And when you took that to the larger scene, it became the politics. So they were intimately linked and connected. The Nicomachean Ethics is one of the most complete works of the ancient world, and it's certainly the easiest to read of all of Aristotle's surviving writings. Now, the Nicomachean Ethics is roughly about 250 pages in modern translation. It's made up of 10 books, or we would say 10 chapters. But in actuality, we're going to focus in only really on the first chapter to sort of get the heart of the theory. If you went on to read more, he would flesh out a lot of these concepts and ideas. He would talk about individual virtues and so on. But we want to just get the gist of the basic idea here. The key concept of Aristotle's virtue ethics is eudaimonia, and he begins the text by saying that each techne, or each skill, aims towards some purpose, and the end goal of our action is happiness. And so just as an example, if you look on the screen here, we see a student, much like you, sitting there taking classes. Now, why is that person taking classes? Well, because they want to earn a degree. But why do you want to earn a degree? Is that an end in and of itself? Well, not really. You don't want it to just sit on a shelf and look nice. It's there because you believe that having that degree will get you a good paying job. Well, what do you want that good paying job for? Well, because I think it's going to make me be able to buy a big house and a nice car, have all these luxury items. And why do you want those things? Well, because I think it's going to make me happy. It may not, but this is what we believe, that having those things is going to make us happy. But now, here's the main point. If you ask that question again, what do you want to be happy for? That question doesn't make any sense. Because happiness is not a means to something else. Happiness is the final end goal of everything that we're aiming towards. All of our actions are building towards this idea of finding happiness. So we have to ask ourselves then, well, what is happiness? What do we mean by happiness? And Aristotle does acknowledge that happiness seems to mean different things to different people. Happiness might imply wealth if you're poor. Happiness might imply companionship if you're lonely. Happiness might imply health if you're sick. But these are just examples, he would say. I want to know what the core definition is. The ancient Greeks thought differently than most of us today because what they wanted were absolutes. And so Aristotle was looking at, or for, that absolute, unyielding, unchanging definition, what is happiness? Well, after going through several maneuvers and talking about several different things, he comes to this basic definition. Happiness is activity in accord with virtue over roughly the whole of one's life with a reasonable amount of external goods. Now, obviously, the heart of this definition is activity in accord with virtue, and we're going to have to talk about that in some detail. But let's look at the other elements. Over roughly the whole of one's life. This is Aristotle's acknowledgement that virtue is not something that you can just sort of tick off and say, there, I've got it, and move on to something else. It's something that you constantly have to strive for, that you constantly have to work for. And once you've got it, you've got to work to maintain it. With a reasonable amount of external goods. That's important too, and again, I think it has a lot to do with his longevity. Because so many people that we've talked about so far, and certainly if we went back to Plato, his old instructor, they would say that this world that we're living in is of no consequence. It's illusion, it's fantasy, and we need to get somewhere else. Happiness resides in another place. But Aristotle, being a very practical-minded, down-to-earth kind of person, is going to say, no, we are part of this material world. And while we may not need to be the Greek equivalent of a Rockefeller, we do need to have certain basic levels of comfort, certain basic levels of things as part of our definition of happiness. Even if it's for no other reason than the fact that we need a good night's sleep in a decent bed. We need good food to give us energy. We need a comfortable place to work so that we can focus on the important things of life. But like Confucius had said, we also need certain diversions within our life. And so you need to go to the sporting event. You need to go to a concert. You need to go to a museum. Do something that benefits the self. That's part of a happy life. But again, the heart of this is activity in accord with virtue. So we have to look at the virtues, and more specifically, how do we acquire these virtues? Well, to understand that, we first have to look at the soul. Now keep in mind that today, when we use the word soul, it has a lot of religious baggage attached to it. But at the time of Aristotle, this wasn't the case. It was basically where the intellect was housed. It was essentially the mind. And so we find that the soul has two elements, the rational and the irrational. The rational side of the soul is unique to human beings. We are the only creatures that possess this. But the irrational side is shared by all of animal kind. Now, when we look at the rational side of the brain, we see two elements. We see reason itself, pure thought, pure ideas. And we also see that which responds to reason. And on the irrational side, we see the seat of appetites and desires, and we see basic biological functions. That's essentially what the soul looks like. Now, because the rational side of the soul is unique to human beings, Aristotle says this is why only human beings are moral creatures. He sets a precedent here that it's really going to be the 20th century before anybody ever tries to challenge this idea that human beings and human beings alone are moral creatures. And the reason for that is because he equates rationality with morality. You have to have a rational mind. You have to be able to weigh options, make choices and decisions, to learn from your mistakes, to be a moral agent. And as he sees it, only human beings are capable of doing that. The rest of animal kind simply has the irrational part, which, of course, as part of the animal species, we do too. Now, if we look at the rational side, the top part of the rational side is reason itself, pure thoughts, pure ideas. And this is where we would find the intellectual virtues. The intellectual virtues are important, and we'll talk about them briefly in a little bit. But we also have, if we go to the bottom, the irrational side, which has basic biological functions. And we can discount these immediately because they're irrelevant to the concept of morality. This would be something like breathing. It just, in Aristotle's view anyway, it just happens. You don't have to force it. You don't have to think about it. It just happens and keeps us alive, just as it would with any animal. What is most interesting, though, in this discussion is the two parts in the middle. The lower portion of the rational, the upper portion of the irrational, that which responds to reason, in the seat of appetites and desires, because these are what gives us the moral virtues of character. All those things that we applaud within people, like courage and generosity and compassion, piety, tenderness, and so on. All these different qualities and attributes, they come because we have the rational side of the mind that can override our animal instincts. Think about it this way. Let's imagine that there's a cabin out in the woods somewhere, and somebody's just baked a hot, fresh apple pie, and they've set it on the ledge to cool. Now, a grizzly bear wandering through the woods is going to smell that pie. Its animal instinct says, that smells good, I'm going to go devour it. And they're going to do that. They're not going to think about whether it's right or wrong to do so. They're not going to question their actions. They are going to have the desire, the want, and they're simply going to act upon it. But a human being wandering through the woods might smell the same pie, might have the same basic idea, the same desire, but yet that human can think, wait a minute, that doesn't belong to me. I can't just go over and eat it. I better ask first, or something along those lines. So we have the ability to override our animal instinct, and that's where our moral virtues of character really come from, is from that ability. We can be courageous, for example, by overcoming the animal instinct. If we think about a firefighter, for example, we say a firefighter is courageous because they're going to run into this burning building when our natural instinct is to flee and to get away from it. Well, that doesn't mean that the firefighter is not respecting of the fire. It doesn't mean that he's not recognizing that there's good reason to be afraid of it and to protect yourself from it. But he's also overriding that instinct to flee by the fact that he has knowledge and skill with regards to this. firefighting, that he has a duty to perform. And so he overrides that fear and runs into the flame when everybody else is running away from it. And so we call that person courageous. A lot of people think courageous means you're not afraid, but as it's frequently been stated, actually it means that you're afraid, but you do what you have to do anyway. You fulfill your duty. And that means overriding those animal instincts. That's where our virtue comes from. Now, when it comes to acquiring virtue, we have to draw a distinction between those moral virtues of character and the intellectual virtues. The moral virtues of character require a role model, and you develop a habit of acting in a certain way. So we have, for example, here a firefighter who could represent the idea of courage. We have someone who works for a charity who's operating through kindness, through generosity. And of course, Mother Teresa, who donated her entire life to trying to help and benefit those who are less fortunate. These are individuals that we would say are very virtuous in their attributes. Well, if we want the virtues that they possess, we would need to watch what they do and mimic their actions. Remember how in the lecture on Confucius, we talked about how you had to have a role model that you could follow. Well, for Aristotle, it's the same way. You can't know how to do something until you've seen somebody else do it. And so that firefighter, for example, is going to act in a particular way, and you, if you want that courage, are going to act in the same fashion. You put yourself in that person's place, in their shoes, and you do what they do. If they, whatever action they perform, you perform it. And in the beginning, your mind is constantly thinking. It's like that idea of conscientiousness in Confucianism. You're constantly looking inside yourself. You're constantly questioning yourself. Is this what is right? Am I doing the right thing? You're overriding constantly those animal instincts. But if you do them long enough, they become a habit. You don't have to think about it anymore. You don't have to force yourself into it anymore. You simply act, and that action is right. So we develop a habit. A habit is something you don't think about. If you have a smoking habit, for example, you get up in the morning and the first thing you do is grab for the cigarette, put it in your mouth, and light it up. You don't think about it. You don't ponder it. It's just habit. It's habitual. And that's what we ultimately want, is to get to that point that acting virtually is habitual. We don't even have to think about it anymore. Now, the intellectual virtues are a little bit different. The intellectual virtues require an instructor, because everybody has to start at the ground, everybody has to start from the bottom and work their way up. No one can immediately become an Einstein. Think of what would happen if you tried to approach intellectual virtues in the same way that you approach the moral virtues of character. You could go in and find Einstein and try to mimic his actions, and yeah, you can get up and forget to put your trousers on in the morning like Einstein used to do. But what happens when you get in the lab and he pulls down this book on quantum physics and starts to read it, and you try to mimic his actions? It's going to take about 3 seconds before you've slammed the book shut and given up, because you have no idea what any of those symbols mean. It's not making any sense to you. You can't just pick up a book on quantum physics and read it and understand it. You have to know some pretty advanced level mathematics first. And before you can know that, you have to know some basic maths. So everybody has to start at the ground floor. So you can go to Einstein, you can go to that person and say, give me a course of study. But it's up to you to put forth the effort, which again is going to be a long-term effort, to learn the basic level first, and then move on to the more advanced level, and then start to read your physics, and then eventually you can understand quantum physics, maybe eventually understanding it in the way that Einstein does, or even beyond. But you can't do that immediately. Everybody has to start at the ground level. And I think you can see why now he says in his definition, over roughly the whole of your life, because you're constantly working at it, and you're constantly trying to improve the self. You're trying to acquire all of these virtues, and once you have them, you're also trying to keep them. So that's very important. Well, that brings us to the question of why does the acquisition of virtues make us happy? And there's really two reasons. The first one I think makes sense right off. It makes the world a gentler and better place, a place that's more conducive to happiness. If I'm taking the time to cultivate and practice these virtues within myself, then presumably I'm not the only one. Other people are doing this as well. And so if I'm acting virtuously towards you and you're acting virtuously towards me, we have a world where there's less violence, less conflict, less difficulty. There's greater opportunity for happiness. The second reason really would have made a lot of sense to an ancient Greek. We really have to think about it, though. And that is that it transforms us into a complete human being. Aristotle believed that as human beings we were born into this world, but we're born essentially as blank slates. We're not born virtuous, but yet we have the potential to become virtuous. And Aristotle, in his Metaphysics, talks a lot about this movement from potentiality towards actuality. So every time that we cultivate a new virtue within ourselves, we are completing ourselves a little bit more. We are taking that from being merely a potential part of us to being an actual part of us. And when we get to that position, if we do, where we possess all of the virtues, both intellectual and moral, then we have completed ourselves. We've become everything we're capable of being. We are a fully developed human being. And that's where great happiness is going to come from, is in that completion of the self. I think that the brilliance of Aristotle's view is the fact that it stays on the personal level, and it's about what it is that it can do to you. Now, granted, again, he does take it to a communal level in the politics, but it can be looked at, and I think is best looked at, on that personal level as a personal ethics. And the personal benefit of virtue ethics is the fact that if you do become a virtuous person, if you act towards others in a virtuous way, you find yourself becoming more joyful. You find yourself becoming happier. On the screen here you see two very familiar characters. One is a depiction of Ebenezer Scrooge, and the other one is the Dalai Lama. Scrooge has all of the money, all of the wealth, all of the things that people seek, but yet he has no time for people. He has no interest in anything other than the acquisition of money. This guy is greedy. He's possessing all sorts of vices, and yet, you know, what is he? He's miserable. On the other hand, you have the Dalai Lama, who you never see without a smile on his face, because his entire life has been devoted essentially to compassion, and he oozes that feeling of compassion out of him. He represents what it is to be a virtuous human being, and that makes him feel good. And in turn, when you are in his presence, or sometimes even just seeing his face, it puts a smile on your face. And so that in and of itself can make you happy, and it can help to make the world a happier place.